My name is Brad Schaefer. I'm the director of the LaCrette Center for California Conservation Science at UCLA. And I just want to say a few words about the LaCrette Center, what we do, sort of how our year has been, and then I will introduce our speaker, Heather Tallis. I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. So the LaCrette Center at UCLA is an academic center. Those of you who aren't familiar with academic centers, we basically fund and we do science, but we try to do science that really makes a difference. So we partner very, very closely with folks like the National Park Service, or the Bureau of Land Management, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or the Natural History Museum downtown. And we partner with them to identify projects that are important and meaningful, that are great science, and that make a difference to the environment and to conservation biology in Southern California and across the state. I've been here 4 years as the director of the LaCrette Center. I'm the founding director of it, and it's been a great year and sort of an interesting transition time. One of our main things that we do is we fund a postdoc program. So those are people who have finished their PhDs and are working for a couple of years between their PhD and a job doing research projects. Our first two LaCrette's postdocs both finished up this past year and have jobs working, one with the government and one with a private non-government organization, continuing their conservation work, which is great. And we've been able to actually hire 3 more. So now we're up to a total of 6 LaCrette's postdocs, which is pretty great. We fund a lot of graduate students at UCLA, and this year, by combining a couple of different programs, we were able to give modest but really important grants to 20 UCLA PhD students and a few undergrads as well. So allowing them to fund their work and to do projects mostly in Southern California. Aimed at, again, research, which is important for management and conservation, as well as strong academic work. We have a lot of other projects and programs that are going on. I won't burden you with all of them, but it's really been good. I feel like the community that we're reaching out to and that UCLA and the LaCrette Center are really a part of is coalescing really nicely, and we're getting some really nice projects going and some nice work going. One of the things that I would like to talk to you about just for a moment, if I can make this behave itself, and perhaps I can and perhaps I can't. Okay. I can desperately push buttons and try. Wrong. Okay, let's try this. There we go. Isn't that great? That didn't work. Okay, let's try this, shall we? Okay, someone give me a hand here. How do I make this? Yeah. Sorry. While we're getting this, you got it?
Maybe.
Let's see just how good our speaker, Heather Tallis, is. Thank you, Heather. One of the projects that I really would like to tell you about just for a minute is this. So the LaCrette's League is our sort of outreach arm where we work with the public, and we do we do nature hikes, we do other public lectures and discussions in collaboration with the Natural History Museum. We do a bunch of different kinds of projects. And we're launching a citizen science project. So what citizen science means simply is that we ask you and people like you who are interested to work with, in this case, it's a group of 5 graduate students from UCLA, if you're interested, to help them do their work. And that can range from projects where you just tell people about the lizards or the mammals that you see in your backyard, and people use that in order to understand how wildlife persists in the urban matrix of Los Angeles, or wildlife diseases and how they're spread around the city. which are both kind of interesting and important elements of these students' research. You can work with them in that way, in a sort of dispersed way. Or we also have some projects where it's just more of a kind of a handful of people, maybe 10, 15 people, 20 people, working much more closely with those students to actually go out and help them collect data and do their work. It's a great opportunity if you're interested, and we have a sign-up sheet out back, which if you haven't signed up now, you're interested, or you know people who might be interested, sign up, give your names, and you're not committed in any way, but it'll just put you on a mailing list. We can try to hook you up with one or more of these students, get you involved in doing some of the citizen science research. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I hope that folks will be interested in taking advantage of it. Of course, now I'm petrified to deal with the slides, so I think I'm just going to leave those up there. Okay, before I introduce today's speaker, there are a few people, 4 to be exact, who I would just like to call out. And before any applause, let me just introduce all 4 of them. And these are 4 people who have been very important either to organizing this lovely event jointly with Pepperdine, or who are just important to the LaCretz Center. The first is Lee Katz. Lee is in the back. Raise your hand, Lee. Lee is a biology professor at Pepperdine. He is also the vice provost for research at Pepperdine. And Lee has sort of opened up the campus to us, let us use these beautiful facilities to hold this annual lecture. So thank you very much, Lee. The second person I would like to introduce is a relatively new member of the UCLA faculty. The LaCretz Center exists within a larger organization called the Institute of Environment Sustainability. We're one of the research centers in the Institute. And about 8 or 9 months ago, we hired a new director of the Institute of Environment Sustainability, Dr. Peter Kariva, who we hired away from the Nature Conservancy. And Peter is back here. And Peter's leadership has been absolutely amazing. And in his short time, he's changed the way we do business in terms of the environment in UCLA. So welcome, Peter. The third person I'd like to introduce is any of you who have been involved with the LaCretz Center at all know his name. My incredible administrative assistant, my right-hand person, the person who helped organize this and everything else that I do, Mario Colon. Mario, of course, isn't here because he's out organizing in the back, but you all met him. He was the only person in the room with a necktie on. So Mario's out back and is just truly amazing. And the fourth person is sort of 2 people, the LaCretz family. The LaCretz Center is named in honor of Morton LaCretz, an amazing environmentalist, philanthropist, citizen of Los Angeles, who very generously gave the initial endowment that has funded the LaCretz Center, that brought me down here, and that allows us to have these kinds of events and fund all those postdocs and graduate students. Mort couldn't be here today, but his daughter, Linda Duttenhaver, who works very closely with Mort, is here. They work hand in hand and are amazing and wonderful partners. Linda, where are you? There's Linda. There we go. So for all of them, thank you very much. So last night, I got back from a 2-week field trip with an amazing group of 14 undergraduates from UCLA. And we were up in Mendocino County and Monterey County. We were camping out. We were crawling through poison oak and getting rained on and studying animals and conservation in 2 different areas. It was a great, fabulous, wonderful trip. It's why I'm a professor and why I do what I do. And during that time, what I realized during those 2 weeks is that part of being a good conservation biologist, part of being a good environmentalist is appreciating nature, appreciating animals, studying them, doing science that contributes to conservation. And part of it is people, part of it is those students, and interacting with them and getting them engaged in the whole process of understanding nature and realizing that nature is important to them and they're important to nature and the conservation of nature. Today's speaker is Heather Tallis. Heather comes to us from the Nature Conservancy, and that sort of interaction between people and nature, the importance of nature to people, the importance of the interaction between nature and people is, to my mind at least, what sort of characterizes Heather and her work with the Nature Conservancy. Heather is the acting chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, a role she started in 2015. And for those of you who don't know, what that means is that she leads all of the science in the most important environmental group in the world, which is the Nature Conservancy. It's a big job, and she does it incredibly well. She's an amazing scientist and an amazing individual. Heather received her bachelor's degree from Eckerd College in Florida, her master's from UC Santa Cruz up north, and her PhD in zoology from the University of Washington. And she's worked on a whole variety of different environmental topics. She's published an amazing list of papers that look at things like the importance of nature in scrubbing our air and keeping our water clean, the importance of having a broad constituency of people in terms of gender diversity, sort of racial diversity involved in the environmental movement. And most recently, and what she'll talk to us about today, is the importance of nature in both education and in human health. And one of the things that I think of when I think of Heather is that something someone told me about her recently, which is her providing the data that shows that if you take a walk outside or you take a group of students outside, they get smarter. And that's a very cool thing. We all kind of, anyone in this room probably knows that, but she's got the data to show that, and that's a very cool thing indeed. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Heather Tallis, and we will hear from her.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see if I can win with the clicker. All right. Thank you, Brad, and thank you all for coming out on a Saturday to hear more about what's outside. Hopefully I can keep you entertained inside. So I'm going to talk today about changing the way people think about nature, which at the core means changing their values. And I'm going to start with my son, Rio, and the president, because why not? But I start with this because my son was 1 month old in 2009 when the president gave his first inaugural speech. And I stood in front of my computer and listened to him and held my kid and had two really strong thoughts. One was really, really true amazement and hope for this country, because I was just blown away that we elected him. And it made me feel like everything's going to be okay for my kid. And then, at the same time, I had another thought, which is that I watched all the debates in that election cycle, and the environment was not mentioned once. Not once in any of the discussions. And that struck me really, really hard and made me think, this is the real issue at the core of conservation. This is why we have a conservation movement. People don't think the environment is a voting issue. I'm going to have a job for a long time, which in the end is not my goal, right? I hope I'm working myself out of a job. So I thought a lot about that, and that's driven my work since then in terms of trying to understand why the nature is so distant from what people think about when they vote and when they make other decisions in their daily life. And if we're honest about it, Most people, if they think about nature, might think about a crazy creature they've seen on a movie, like this eye from Madagascar. Or they might think about it as a place that they go on vacation, here a couple hours drive away from the desert in Joshua Tree. They don't think about nature when they turn on the tap, though in California, they probably are getting better at that. They don't think about nature when they send their kids to school or choose which school their kids should go to, as most people in California have the opportunity to do. They don't think about nature when they open the refrigerator or go to the store, or when they think about the economy or invest their own funds for retirement or for gain. And if we're really, really honest about it, this is the way most people think about nature, which is not at all. That's why this room isn't full of thousands of people on a Saturday afternoon. This is what I'm aiming for in the work that we do now, is to get people to at least have this thought, that nature matters to them in their daily life for some reason. And so I'm going to talk today about two areas of work that we're expanding in, education and health, where that's my aim, is to understand better what the scientific basis for some feasible and tangible connection is between the environment that we all live and work in and our own benefit, our own physical response to that. So with education, lots of you know there's been a lot of really good research about kids getting outside in nature, and there being positive benefits from that. We have whole education programs now that recognize that and do outdoor play and outdoor-based learning. We have on-school programs that bring gardens to schools and bring opportunities for kids to be outside more and be exposed to more of the environment. But we usually sort of stop there, outside the school, and in active interaction with the environment when we think about children benefiting in education from outdoor-based learning. When we turn to the classroom, traditional indoor education, we stop thinking about nature. We think about other things that we know are important, that we have big political discussions about, right? The level of funding to the school, the socioeconomic status of the students, the classroom size, the curriculum, the teacher training levels. These are all things we know matter to education, and this is somewhat representative of the list. And nature is not on this list. And there's emerging information that suggests maybe it should be. So there's been a decent amount of work with adults that show that even brief 15-minute exposures to nature outside improve cognitive function, things like simple number recall or simple math abilities. There's been some work with children in housing contexts where people have studied children who move from a housing complex in a very built environment with a lot of buildings and great infrastructure around it to a housing complex with more greenery, more nature. And they show they have increased ability to focus their attention. One of the biggest problems in education for some children, being able to focus their attention. And we have a few focus studies with small sample sizes from schools where people have looked at whether or not students can benefit from a different view out the window. Simply being able to see nature. Not go outside and play in it, not go do active learning in it, but just being able to see it. One study from Minnesota showed that there was a correlation between test performance and more trees and shrubs around schools. So this starts to give us an indication that there may be a basis for us to think that even just seeing more nature on a regular basis can help students learn. I thought this was pretty intriguing. I don't know anything about education. I'm not trained in education, but this seemed like a pretty compelling line of research that was worth following up. And so I've been collaborating with some folks at Stanford University and, strangely but for good statistics, with the Northwest Fisheries Marine Science Center. And we're looking at this and asking a few questions. First, is there really a widespread relationship between the greenness around schools and students' performance? Second, is it big enough to matter? In all the studies that have been done so far, we see a hint, a suggestion that there's a positive relationship, but it's not clear how big it is. Is it big enough to be important relative to things like the socioeconomic status of the students or the classroom size? That's never been answered. And finally, what is it about the view? In some studies, they've just looked at greenness, literally the color green, that suggests that adults do better if they see more greenness. That's the way we've measured it scientifically from satellite imagery, which means if you see a green cornfield, you're going to be just as much smarter as if you see green nature. So from a conservation perspective, that's an important question, right? What is it really about the naturalness of the view that matters? So we're starting to dig into these questions in a few states across the US. We picked these 5 because they have the 5 fastest growing cities in the country in them, and as states they capture over 1/3 of the student population in the United States. And so there'll be a lot of new schools built in these states in the next decade, and we think learning something about how nature might interact with them, can have a good potential to influence school design. I'm going to show you today just the results from California, where we started as a pilot. These are all the schools that we included in the study. It's 500 schools across the state. That's a lot of schools. Most of the studies that have looked at this in the past have about 20. The largest one had 60. So we're really trying to look much more broadly at a scale that might matter. As all of you who live here also know, California is kind of like a country. There's a lot of people here. It's very diverse. There's a very large economy. It's also ecologically very diverse. There's 11 different ecoregions here. We have 2 mountain ranges, deserts, redwoods. So it's very diverse in terms of what nature is. And so it gives us a really great template to ask, across the whole breadth of what we might encounter in school surroundings, does nature matter? And this gets to the question about what is it about the view? If there is something about the view that matters, we asked about 3 different characteristics. First, just the color green, because this is what people have looked at before. Second, naturalness, which just indicates whether or not that green is a cornfield. And third, structure. Again, that study from Minnesota showed trees and shrubs mattered, so maybe there's something about the structure of the view that interrupts our thought process in a way that's beneficial. So we asked about these 3 different things around schools. And I'm going to give you a sense of how different those look and why we thought it was important to have more than one measure. And I'm going to show you just 2 schools that were in this study, one in Cupertino, near where I live, and one in 29 Palms, just east of here. So these are 2 schools. We had to start by actually finding the footprint of the schools. So the yellow in both of these cases is the actual buildings of the school. And then you can see around them from satellite imagery here, greenness. So this is again literally the color green, showing us where there's green vegetation growing. And you can see in Cupertino, even though it's very urban and built, there's a lot of trees and landscaping and a lot of green and vegetation. In the desert, not so much green. Okay, so this gives you a sense that we can pick up those differences with this measure. And then we look at naturalness. So now, 29 Palms and the desert area around it is quite natural, but it wasn't green, right? So that gives us a different view of what the surroundings of the school look like. And then finally, trees and shrubs. We actually counted every single tree and shrub in the areas around these schools with high resolution imagery. And again, you can see not many trees and shrubs in the desert, lots of them in Cupertino. So it just gives you a sense of how we can start to differentiate what's around these schools. And then we took that information from those 500 schools and added it into a question alongside some of those other factors we know are important. We used standardized test scores that are publicly available in California from the STAR system and asked whether or not adding those view factors to traditional factors like socioeconomic status, minority representation, explained more of the differences in test scores that we saw across schools. So I'm going to show you the results now, and the first question I'm going to answer is about the view. The question is, do any of these 3 features around the school matter in terms of test scores? And the answer is yes, and it's only trees and shrubs. So in this case, from this study set, from these schools, we see a positive correlation between the number of trees and shrubs around schools and standardized test scores across all 3 subjects that we looked at. And I'll note here that in our data set, we saw this most strongly in cities. I have to say, though, that we used the census definition of cities, which is pretty much anything we'd call a town. So I'm going to take that cities result lightly, but it certainly indicates that even in high-density areas, having trees and shrubs around might be beneficial. And there's one way to think about explaining that pattern, and this comes from psychology. There's a theory for why seeing nature might help us perform better in cognitive functions. It's called attention restoration theory, and it goes something like this. We evolved as people for a very, very long time in nature, and our brains got used to a certain amount of stimulus. And now, when we live in cities, the stimulus is much higher for all of our senses. There's more noise, there's more visual stimulus, there's more people close to us in our personal space, and we use the part of our brain that allows us to focus our attention more than we would if we were in an environment with less stimulus. And so the idea with this theory is that when you see nature, even if only briefly, it allows your brain to relax the part of it that's using itself to focus. And when you return return to cognitive thinking or work, it's rested like a muscle. So that's the theory that psychology's put forward to explain why there may be this kind of benefit. It's not proven. There's other theories that also exist, but I just want to give you one sense of how people suggest this might be working. Now, the second question, is the relationship big enough to matter? I'm going to say again, this is a correlative study, so we can't say these relationships are causal, as in the green space is causing students to do better, but we can ask whether or not these things are related. And so I'm going to start here with the results to give you a sense of how big the effects are from things we usually talk about in schools. So these are the first two sets of findings from minority representation and socioeconomic status of students in the schools. And basically, to interpret this graph, for minority representation across the range of low minorities in the school to high, we see an 8% difference in test scores. Okay, so that gives you a sense that that factor is related to about an 8% difference. And socioeconomic status of the students or poverty is related to about a 2% difference in test scores. So even these things we're used to thinking about as very important from school to school have relatively small relationships with test score difference. Okay, so these aren't large effects. So then the question is, do trees and shrubs have a similar size, or smaller or bigger? And here it is. So in this set of schools, tree and shrub cover has a larger effect size than poverty across the schools. So I'm just going to let that sink in a little bit. The trees and shrubs around schools, in 500 schools in California, across the range, while controlling for minority representation, while controlling for funding level to schools, while controlling for class size, the additional affected tree or shrub cover is bigger than poverty. So again, that's astonishing and not a causal proof. Okay, so it's a suggestion that the effect could be really big. So to me, that means we need to look further and try and understand causally what's going on. So we had a couple other questions we wanted to answer, which is how many trees are we talking about, and how far around the school does this really matter? And so we looked at 7 different distances from the school grounds themselves up to a kilometer, or about half a mile away, radius around the schools. And the results show that basically you have to get to about 750 kilometers to a kilometer before we see the pattern. So that means we're not talking about school grounds, which suggests we are talking about the view or some kind of exposure the students are having when they're walking to and from school if they live nearby, or some experience that they're having while they're in the classroom seeing further away from the school. So that would suggest that to test this, we want to look at things that are more along the lines of urban green space development, urban planning, additional neighborhood greening, not just on school property, landscaping and gardens. So that gives us an idea of where to explore more to see if this effect is real. And then I also want to give you a sense of the amount of trees we're talking about that showed a difference. And it's not planting trees everywhere. So this is a picture from one of the actual schools in this study that had low tree and shrub cover, less than 1%. This is what it looks like if you're standing on the street looking away from the school. This is another school that had less than 1%. This kind of gives you a sense of the low end. This is what we're talking about starting with. But then if we're going to green those schools up to enough cover for us to think there might be a difference, how many trees is that? Well, here's an example. This is an average school for California for that data set. The school has 22% tree and shrub cover around it. So it's not an urban jungle. We're not talking about trees everywhere. This is another one with 22% cover in another one. Okay, so we're not talking about massive transformation of the urban environment, but we are talking about sort of neighborhood scale changes in the amount of trees and shrubs around. Okay, and now I'm going to switch to wild conjecture in the context of what this might mean if it's real. Okay, so everything I say from here forward is not proven. So if that relationship is real, I want to give you a sense of why we should really think about doing this with some schools. If we think about the magnitude of effect that I showed, if we go from a school like this with less than 1% tree cover to an average school in the California study, we get about a 4.2% increase in test scores across the full range of difference. There's a policy being discussed in California to extend the schooling hour by 15 minutes. Doing that, policy analysis has shown would increase test scores 1%. As an alternative wild conjecture, to get that same amount of increase in test scores, we'd have to start with a school that had 99% of students on free and reduced lunch and reduce poverty to the extent that only 14% of students were on free and reduced lunch. That's an enormous change in socioeconomic status of students to get the same amount of improvement in test scores. So again, I'm not saying if we go do this, this is what will happen, but if it did, this is what we're talking about in terms of relative influence to the kinds of policies and practices that we talk about today in terms of improving education. So that says to me we should try it, and so we are currently looking for schools that will work with us experimentally. And we have some that are starting to be interested in New York City and in Kentucky, interestingly. And so we're continuing those conversations, and we're looking to do one of two things. In education contexts, there have been successful studies that use classroom switching, where you take a whole classroom full of students and their teacher, and you move them to another room that has somehow a different environment. This was done a lot with noise pollution in the 70s and 80s. And so we could do a similar thing here, where we find a school that's large enough that, say, there's multiple fifth grade classrooms, and the school has very different views on one side than the other, and the whole classroom switches for a period of time, and we see if their performance on tests change. So that's a perfect model because we control everything. It's all the same students, it's all the same curricula, it's the same teacher. The only thing that's different is the classroom. Or alternatively, we might do some experimental plantings, where we take schools that are at that low end, of less than 1% cover, and do large plantings, possibly in part of the school, and again, track student performance for the ones where the view's been changed and see if their performance changes. So this is what we're looking to do next, and we'll see if all that wild conjecture has any basis. But I think it's a pretty compelling suggestion, at least, that something pretty different is happening when kids see nature than we might expect. So hopefully in the next year or two, we'll be able to answer this question, whether or not nature is an affordable and a reliable way to improve education. So now I'm going to switch to health. It's another area where there's increasing evidence and increasing exploration as to whether or not and how exposure to nature influences our health. There's been good research here in some areas, but not so much in core areas of health. And there certainly is some parts of the public health community and the medical community as a whole that think about nature a lot. For example, infectious disease and emergent zoonotic disease, things like Ebola and Zika are obviously top of mind for some people now, and those start in nature. So that part of nature and health intersection has been researched for a long time in many ways. There are other parts, though, that are starting to show up that suggest we should think even more deeply about how the environment and health are connected. And I'm going to give you a couple of those examples. Now, none of this is from my work. This is published work from others. But I find it really compelling, and it's driving us to think about if and how to get engaged more with health research. So this is a study that came out 2 years ago from Boston, where there was a group of medical doctors who followed almost 2,000 patients who were admitted to Beth Israel for stroke. And then they followed all of these patients for an additional 12 years after they were released from the hospital. And they asked and paid attention to whether or not they went home to greener or less green neighborhoods. And so this is a survival curve of those people after they were released from the hospital on day 0 for 12 years. And as the line goes down, people are dying. So survival is getting lower and lower. And so what they found is that if you went home to a less green neighborhood, you died faster. And if you went home to a more green neighborhood, you died less fast. And so out here at about 10 years, in this very rigorous medical study, if you went home to a more green space than a less green space, you had about a 10% better chance of still being alive. That's a pretty significant finding, and as one of my colleagues recently summarized this, it basically means plant trees or die. I don't often get to have such clear messages, but it's a pretty obvious one. Okay, so that was stroke, not something we usually associate with the environment, right? What's the mechanism for that? It hasn't been explored or explained, but that is a study that draws a pretty tight tie between something about the greenness of your home environment and your ability to recover from traumatic health events. So I'm going to give another story here, which is quite different from the stroke one, but I think is equally powerful. And so some of you are familiar with conservation, will be familiar with the efforts that have gone on in that community for decades to stop deforestation. We do that for biodiversity benefits, of course, but a lot of what drives deforestation is land clearing for agricultural conversion. And in parts of the world, especially where biodiversity is more sensitive, like in the tropics, some of that clearing is done with fires, or the methods that are used for clearing often lead to large fires, and those fires create a lot of smoke. Besides a lot of biodiversity dying, there's a lot of smoke, and it's become very clear that that smoke can be very, very large as a plume, very, very present, and a large risk to health. You obviously all live in a place where you may experience that yourselves on occasion, and increasingly we're seeing large fire risk in the West in the United States. But this has been going on for a long time in Indonesia. This is in 1997, the smoke plume from the fires that were burning in one part of the year that was exceptionally dry, and that obviously you can see by satellite and extends across almost the entire Indian Ocean. So an issue that we are very concerned about from a conservation perspective has a very large, not localized, effect on air quality in a way that leads to serious challenges for respiratory disease. And this is what happened just last year in Indonesia. Some of you may have seen this in the news, where there were equally large fires in Indonesia. The plume extended to Singapore, to mainland Thailand, and there was a Twitter fest of people in extended areas of Indonesia asking their president to evacuate them. The haze was so bad, the smoke was so intense, it was considered an emergency. And if we look at this at a global scale, this is the most shocking data to me when I started to look at the medical data on disease burden and causes of death and disease. So this is a data set from the world's leading source of information on disease and death, the Global Burden of Disease database. And they put out a report every couple of years that summarizes the causes of death globally and puts them in order of importance. And so this is the top 20 leading global causes of death from the 2013 data, which is the last that they've reported on. And I'm going to point out, so all of these different colors, don't worry about, they associate with the final diseases that people die or have burdens from. And these are the risk factors. These are the things that lead to them being harmed by those diseases. And so you'll see number 2 is household air pollution from solid fuels, which I'll come back to in a second. And not too much farther down on the list is ambient particulate matter pollution, which means largely smoke and other particulates in the air. And I was very surprised to learn that this is linked to another major environmental problem that we have in the conservation community, which is that solid fuel basically means fuel wood and charcoal. So people harvesting fuel wood locally or buying charcoal and using it indoors as a cheap form of energy for their houses. And the smoke from that use is incredibly damaging, leading to it being the second largest cause of death and disease globally, from the number of people who use fuel wood and charcoal as indoor energy sources. And so that's, again, it's not the deforestation link, it's another link where people unsustainably harvesting that fuel wood is a major challenge for biodiversity. And so we have the opportunity here to solve a key challenge for terrestrial biodiversity and a major leading global health issue with one intervention or one solution. And that to me is really compelling and not something we talk about in the conservation community or what the health community talks about when they are looking for solutions to major public health concerns. And so I just show you this to give you a sense of, again, the potential that we have here to shift both the science and the discourse about whether or not the environment matters to health. These data show really clearly that it does, and in ways we certainly don't usually expect. And so I think at this point it's fair to say there is enough evidence that nature and health are connected, and not just in ways we're used to seeing in health magazines, like if you go ride your bike outdoors, you'll be healthier, but in really core ways, like you might not die from stroke, and billions of people won't die from respiratory disease. That's a very different story than what we usually hear about the environment and health, and I think there's a very compelling story to tell about core health and major diseases and what nature has to add to solving those problems. So I've given you a little bit of a tour of some of the science that's emerging that suggests there are really core ways nature matters to each of us in our daily lives, in different ways in different places, but that each of us probably has some compelling reason to think that nature matters. So my hope with this kind of research and this kind of exploration is that we can move from this as the common thought about nature to maybe this one. Nature matters to my kids' education. I can say personally, I started following this line of research when I was looking at schools for my now 7-year-old son, and one that I really liked in Santa Cruz was a charter school, and it had K through 6 in the basement. And I stopped looking at it. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about, right? If there really is a strong tie to children's exposure to nature through classroom windows, it really changes the discourse about conservation and education. Or maybe people will start to think this: nature matters to my health. Again, when you go to the doctor or when you think about what's important in health policy, there's a whole range of issues that aren't currently on the table or in dialogue that may be really critical. And finally, in the end, this is the objective: to get people to think nature matters to me in some way. So with that, I will end, and I think we will change to a panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Heather. That's, so I guess if you want to get smart and you want to live a long time, you plant a tree or you at least walk around and look at trees. That's, it's pretty amazing. Okay, what we'd like to do now is I would like to invite 3 people to come up and join Heather, or 2 other people to join Heather as a panel, Ursula Heise, Heather, and Brad Rumble up front. And John Christensen is going to be our moderator for this panel. John is sitting here. And just very briefly, I just want to say a couple of words about our other 2 panelists. What we're going to do is have John just ask a few questions, a few prompts, if you will, to kind of get the conversation going, and then open it up to you guys, to questions you might have for Heather, for the other panelists, in terms of the relationship between nature, the environment, and you and your life. So our 2 panelists are Brad Rumble. Brad is the principal at Esperanza Elementary School in downtown LA, and I know Brad because we both are interested in birds and bird watching. Brad has been, certainly in my mind, one of the real leading advocates for the importance and role of nature and the environment in raising test scores and doing exactly what Heather was talking about, raising test scores and raising the sort of quality of education in the underserved communities and elementary schools of inner city LA. And our other panelist is Ursula Heise. Ursula is a professor in the English department at UCLA, and a person I collaborate with on a number of different projects at UCLA. Ursula does sort of environmental humanities and has worked extensively on issues relating to species conservation, species extinction, sort of cultural differences in how people view species and biodiversity. She's a wonderful connection at UCLA between our North Campus, which is the humanities, and our South Campus, which is the sciences. And Ursula is one of the few people who traverses that sometimes enormous cultural gap with tremendous grace and ability. And our moderator is John Christensen. John is the journalist in residence, senior researcher and adjunct professor at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. John is all of our go-to guy, all of ours go-to guys for sort of anything having to do with outreach journalism and the environment. He has an amazing record working with amazing newspapers and other journalistic outputs and units. He's the editor of Boom magazine, a wonderful magazine that I encourage you to take a look at. And if you want advice on anything in terms of the environment, and certainly if you're interested in controversy, John is your man. So he will be our moderator for this. John.
Is this your Brad?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. Hello. Hi, Heather. Brad. Nice to meet you. You know, I think I'd love. I mean, this is a wonderfully succinct and direct and provocative talk with some great empirical findings that, you know, certainly I think get my brain going, both on, you know, with education and health. I mean, that rise in test scores and the rise in longevity after a stroke, or else kind of give you pause to think. And you know, I don't know if these shrubs up here on the table are enough for your attention restoration effect to come into, you know, in this room without windows. But I think that the talk was certainly provocative in that regard. And I would just like to ask, you know, Brad and Ursula first, I mean, to respond to the talk, and what were your thoughts, you know, from where you come from in hearing these results?
Well, I have to tell you that it's so funny, but I got an email on Thursday where we're getting a library renovation project going at my school. We're the one school in LA Unified to receive a grant from Heart of America Foundation. So this email said, we don't have enough money for the iPads and the removal of the opaque windows to glass windows so the kids can look out and see the trees. Which would you rather do? Which one do you think I went for?
The trees.
The trees. Yes. So there you go. I think where I connect to your work, it was funny because there were some slides up here that just before the lecture with some of the students from Lacrette's, and one of them said, let's get it. It was Leptospira interrogans, and I had this little panic, think I'm probably the only person in the room that doesn't know what that is. I'm a practitioner, I'm not a scientist. I'm a veteran of Los Angeles Unified, graduate of UCLA, by the way, undergrad and grad, much more North Campus. But where I connect to this work is just working in 3 inner city schools for my career, right there in the urban core of Los Angeles. It was the absence of nature which brought me to the birds. It's the absence of nature which really informed my interest in doing something about these campuses. And really thinking, is this what our students deserve? Do we need to settle for this? We don't settle for disruptive behavior on campus. We shouldn't settle for poor teaching. Why would we settle for just asphalt on a campus?
To me, the crucial question that Heather, your really fascinating talk brought up is, does it matter whether we see real trees, or would we have the same effect if we showed the kids a bunch of really slow-paced, detailed nature documentaries. And I'm asking this because a few years ago, it came my turn to be president of ASLI, the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. That was an organization that was founded in the early 90s, and our joke about ourselves at the time was we're the literary critics who'd rather be hiking. In other words, we'd rather be hiking than reading books, but of course, that's our job, right? And there's always been, in the American as well as other national environmental movements, there's been the idea that being out in nature is really good for you. And then reading really great books about nature, like John Muir or Rachel Carson, is also really good for you and will enhance your attachment to nature. Those are actually two totally contradictory things. So the way literary critics handled this for a while was we said, oh, well, reading about nature is good, but watching TV and internet, that's really bad for you, And then, Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth came around, and he said, no, actually, film's okay, but internet, that's still really, really bad for you, and we need to. So in other words, I think there's always been this sort of, I think we don't know whether it's a myth or a reality that it's the confrontation of your physical body with authentic nature that changes you. And that's what struck me about your talk, is that we really have no idea whether that's true or not. And whether for a certain generation it was reading John Muir or reading Mary Austin or reading Edward Abbey that actually got them interested in nature. And whether for a different kind of generation, it's watching National Geographic and watching the old really good Disney nature documentaries. Or in Germany, where I grew up, the nature documentaries that in the 1960s, director of the Frankfurt Zoo, Bernhard Jimek, made about Africa in Spain. Felix de la Torre did this series of television shows called El Hombre y la Tierra that really transformed the Spanish public sphere, even still under the Franco dictatorship, where it was television that actually sort of started a national environmental movement. And these days, who knows? Is it the kids, going online and doing SimPet or something like that actually does give them an experience of getting interested in animals, getting interested in animal behavior, and so forth. And so I think that to me is ultimately the question that your talk raises. So do we really believe that it's only being out there on the hiking trail, and that's the only thing that's going to get people attached to nature, in which case I think we're in trouble? Or do we also believe that mediated experience of nature can actually do a lot of that work?
But your work, yes, I want to just try to be, this work is not, it seems to point to it's not even necessarily about being out in nature, it's just being able to see it.
Right.
Through a window.
Yeah, so I think there's two interesting things to point out from that line of thinking. One is that people have done research with adults looking at their physiological responses, not cognitive, but physiological responses to being outside, seeing the same outside through a window, seeing a picture of that same view, and seeing a digital image of the same view. And some of the physiological responses come up regardless of which it is, and some only come up if it's the real view or being outside. So there's some indication that some of the responses, you got to have the real thing, and others, you could watch a nice movie. The other thing I want to mention is that Greg Bratman's one of my collaborators on the education work that we're doing, and he's doing more at Stanford with exposure to nature with students, college students. And he did this interesting study where he sent half of them on a walk at the Dish, which is this outdoor oak savanna location, and half of them down El Camino Real, which is a really busy urban street. And he did functional MRIs on their brains before and after, and he did mood surveys. So asked them how they felt, and he asked them about their attachment to nature, and compared all those. And so the functional MRI shows different blood flow patterns, which are really distinct and show some kind of physiological response. But people who had better cognitive function didn't have to have said that they were happier being in nature. So basically, whether or not they liked it, they got the benefit, which I think is really fascinating, which suggests it's not people, feeling personally connected to nature in some way, and so that triggering some mental or emotional response. They could be like really irritated that they got sent to the dish and still have benefits.
It's like eating your peas and spinach.
That's exactly right.
Even if you
Go
don't,
for a walk.
it's
That's
good
how
for
you get
you,
it.
whether you like it or
But
not.
is that because consciously or unconsciously a walk to the dish is leisure, whereas a walk along El Camino means you have to go do something, run errands, do shopping
Yeah.
or something like that?
It could be. I mean, I think the main point is there's been such little exploration of, differentiating this stuff. There's just been dips into us recognizing like this stuff should be studied scientifically and medically and educationally, right? That there are all these open questions.
Hey, but Brad, I know for folks who may not know, your school is near downtown, near MacArthur Park. In the Westlake. Do I have that right?
That's all true.
What's that?
All true.
Yeah, and so, so you're near one of Los Angeles's great parks, not that far from it, but a park that's very urban in its own character. I want to ask both of you a question. So, but what do you think about these results that say it might not matter so much what you plant on campus as what is 750 meters or even a kilometer away, which I think would get you to MacArthur Park. And
Yeah, we use MacArthur Park. I was there Monday with some bird watching students as they opened up a new entrance there. In fact, one of the first things I did, I'm in my second year at the school, but without a lot of nature on campus, I thought, let's use the park. And I started with third grade, incredible group of teachers, and I figured, let's study the ducks of MacArthur Park. And so they did a 6-week unit studying 2 species of ducks. We have birders out here. We studied,
Sure.
right, I know you. So we studied the dabbling duck, the mallard, and then, which is a resident duck there, and then a diving duck called the ringneck duck. And the students became experts in those 2 species. And of course, it led to other lines of research as well, getting into weather and where do they go when they migrate and such. So you use what's in your backyard. But I would say to you, I have about 860 students at my school. Not one student lives in a single-family dwelling. They all live in apartments, and many are in high-rise apartments. Some, the restrooms are down the hall that the families share, and I can go on. If nature's going to happen, it's going to happen for them on this campus. They're not going to go on a bike ride down Wilshire Boulevard. They're not really going to get that nature in their buildings. And I would say to you, there are some that play soccer on the weekends, but that's not, at this time, so much a family park. I would love for it to become that. But really, if nature's going to happen for these students, largely it will happen on campus.
And wanted to your finding of the 1% cover versus the 22% cover that you showed us, and without getting too technical and looking at the effects were at 2 standard deviations, which is a pretty large deviation. Where does the good effect? Can I ask this as a naive question? Like, where does the good effect start? Is it at 10%? Do you have a sense of that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can answer that very well from this study, and that's
You could speculate, though, some wild speculation.
I mean, wild speculation would say you'll start to see small incremental improvements with 2% and 3%. I mean, I would suggest that going from 1% to 10%, if this is a common and defensible pattern, would not be dog meat.
Yeah.
or wild conjecture. I mean, I would say that. And, we don't know if that's linear, we don't know if it maxes out, so anything about that relationship and what design should look like, I can't answer clearly, which is why I want to do the experimental stuff with different designs and see what happens.
And I think if we look around Los Angeles, I mean, I totally understand what you're saying and agree with it about if we look around neighborhoods in Los Angeles, like the neighborhood where your school is, there are neighborhoods that don't have a lot of nature. And whether it's green or it's not green, there's not a lot, of that. And if it's going to be provided for students, for young people, for families, for everybody, it's going to have to be provided as a public good. And the schools do seem like I don't want like the place to start to do that. Particularly looking at the difficulties that the last mayor had with the Million Trees program. I was thinking about it. I mean, there was this ambitious program to plant a lot of trees in these kinds of neighborhoods and in these places, but the problem was taking care of them.
Mm-hmm. So I think your question leads us to stewardship. And I think we need to make stewardship an important concept in our schools. I don't think that's present right now. There are pockets of stewardship, but how do we build that to scale?
And Ursula, I want to press a little bit on Heather's assertion that most people don't think about nature at all. I'm not sure that seemed to be an assumption. I'm not sure that one's been empirically tested. I know that you're very, very interested in animals and the animals that people keep and take care of, and you yourself have birds and turtles that are rescue animals. And what do you think about this assertion that most people don't think about nature at all? In part, I'm coming at it thinking that's because we haven't asked the right question about what do people care about, what do they think about as nature?
Yeah, I mean that would also be a question. Why is it connected with vegetation and with plants here? I mean, certainly what animals people keep and what herbs they grow on their balconies and those kinds of things, provide another kind of window into what people are concerned with and what experiences of nature they have. So I think I think the question of what we construe as nature and where we look for experiences of nature is absolutely crucial.
And to clarify, I think people think minimally about nature when they make critical decisions, right? When they make voting decisions, when they make investment decisions, when they, as CEOs, make supply chain decisions. So I don't question whether or not people occasionally in some way think about nature. I think there's good evidence in lots of places that people seldom think about nature when they make those key impact decisions that they're making for other good reasons, usually. Right?
And now there's been over the last 10 years or so, 15 years, there's been a huge change in the way in which, for example, decisions about what you eat get related to the environment. Mm-hmm. I mean, that simply wasn't the case in the 1980s, but from the 1990s and the introduction of Whole Foods and mesclun salad mixes and things like that, and Starbucks coffee, in a sort of pseudo-European coffee house culture, suddenly people ask where food comes from, how it was grown, whether it's organic or not, in a way that they simply, in the US, did not 40 years ago. And so that's become a whole new fulcrum, I think, where people do think about and think about nature in terms of what they eat all the time.
So I want to get you all thinking about what questions you want to ask. I want to ask, yes, respond, but I also want to ask you what do you think your students think about when they think about nature? I mean, before you start exposing them to these ducks and everything, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think Ursula brings up just in asking these questions that are emerging. So where does our food come from? That definitely seems a more interesting question to the 21st century person than maybe the 20th century person even. Another question I would say is, why does it matter what we plant? Because I think that will lead us into biodiversity. So why not have biodiversity hot zones on every campus? So this is what we did at Leopoldina Elementary School, working with Margot Griswold, the landscape ecologist who's in the room from Los Angeles Audubon Society. She'd already taken her work from the work that she was doing with students at the high school level and involving Robert Jeffers and folks from Dorsey High School. Those high school students became experts really in native plants and understanding how the importance of planting. When you plant natives, there's an added benefit for the biodiversity in that area, right? They applied that coming over to our school, working with our students. But it wasn't like high school students just came over and said, okay, today we're going to plant this. Our students in third, fourth, and fifth grade started to study the land on which the school is situated and found out it was coastal sage scrub. And if we plant these plants, we'll be helping a lot more than just what our campus looks like. There's an added biodiversity benefit. And of course, as things started to grow, things started to show up. Insects and then the birds. And I have to tell you, there has been zero incident report, any kind of bad news coming out of what we planted or what showed up. It's all been just jackpots for these students.
So I've been asked to come up with a closing question after we get a lot of questions. So I want you to start thinking about it. And you've already started to kind of answer that to what's the connection? I'm not sure that I totally got what the connection is to conservation. Since we're here at the with the Lacretz Center for California Conservation Science, I want to end with that. I mean, to make that logical connection from the schoolyard and health and education to conservation in California and the world. What questions do you all have? Please stand up and introduce yourself and ask the question.
We have a couple microphones, so raise your hand. I know we have one hand up front here. And ask.
Here's one right here.
My name's Jeannie Butler. I just wondered, in the education study, if you studied or measured anything other than test scores.
No.
Okay.
Other people have in other contexts. There have been, again, small-scale studies that look at behavior responses and attention responses and mood responses. Most of them so far, one of the reasons that we have just a few things about the view is because often the view-related studies have these 55 characteristic view indices, and you just have no idea what's going on. So it's hard to pull much out of the ones that have been done so far, but obvious huge interest in expanding the questions we're asking, and that experimental context gives us more ability to do that too.
Yeah, Brad, do you see any other results?
Yes. I would suggest maybe a line of study in terms of student attendance, parent engagement, and then also the socio-emotional status of students. Huge benefits.
How do you measure the socio-emotional status of students?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, you can look at things like student suspensions or office discipline referrals, things like that. But, as we got into this work at Leopoldina Elementary, people would say there's a magic on this campus. And I would want to somehow be able to quantify.
A measure of magic.
Magic measure.
That's a good one.
But also, just in terms of children with autism, children with special needs, and then in terms of children who have been exposed to trauma or are going through, children going through very difficult situations, huge benefit for these students to get outside. I think this ties into Heather's research.
But that's different, right? I mean, so that going outside is different from what you were describing, which was just having a view of nature from inside the classroom.
We're getting, you haven't mentioned, I'm recalling this study, so my impression of a lot of this literature in some of the studies that have done on patients post-procedures, from my reading it, there was kind of a gradient, right? Like having a picture of nature on the wall had a benefit. Being able to see a tree out a window had a benefit that was a little bit more than the picture on the wall, and being able to actually get outside and walk with a tree around had an additional benefit from seeing it through the window. But
I want to point out, she had her hand.
Yeah.
yes, we have a...
Hi, thank you. My name is Dr. Rhonda Jessam. I'm a clinical psychologist, eco and conservation psychologist. This is my daughter, Anya. And I would love to speak further about the connection between conservation and psychology, because to me that's so intuitive, I can't even describe. I've loved that. I can go on about that forever. But I'm very intrigued by the connection between improved education and health. And my daughter and I have just won awards for the California Safe Schools because of our work in environmentalism in the school district, specifically Las Virgenes Unified School District, in terms of trying to inspire the school district to reduce toxic chemicals and go for least hazardous pest management. So while you're talking today, I'm just exploding with excitement. That's why I keep raising my hand, because after doing this for at least 6 years or more and trying to advocate for more nature, more natural environment, indigenous, we're in the Santa Monica Mountains, we're in a wetland community. Why not we have our own project with that in Malibu, our own preserve that we're doing in a habitat. Why not have all the schools participating in that? And my experience has been that it has to do with money. It has to do with making cultural change as far as the consciousness of what you're bringing to light today, which is the benefit versus the immediate. I loved when you said it has to do with decision making, because I was like, absolutely, because nobody connects that. When they're in the school board meeting and they're making major decisions, it's like, well, the answer has been, we do whatever we can afford, not what's in the best interest of the children. So where is the money going to come from?
Okay,
because that's the big question.
Yeah. So, and congratulations on your award. That's wonderful. Do you want to answer that? I mean, particularly, I think of having, I did some research on vegetation cover in Los Angeles, and you see that there are parts of the city up against the mountains and other places that have a lot of green, but there are parts of the city where your school is, south of there and south central, and others where there's very little green. And it is about, how are we going to get that? How can the people, I think, in this room and those of us, what do you think to get this to scale beyond your school to other schools?
So, there was a schoolyard instructional schoolyard task force created by Los Angeles Unified School District. I participated on it. Others in the room participated. I think there's interest there. I think this kind of research is really important because it makes that connection. I have to tell you, I think folks in risk management feel, a flat asphalt surface means less tripping, right? But, that's like, what is it? Penny wise and pound foolish. because, ultimately there are much greater benefits for taking out that asphalt, and not all of it. I understand that, children need a place to play, although we want permeable surface, right? But the first thing we did at Politi, my former school, was to kill the Bermuda grass, turn off the sprinklers. They've never been turned on again. And we ripped out asphalt. And what's there, the native habitat, it needs a little bit of water, nothing like it needed before. So,
but trees need water, don't they? You got trees?
Trees and shrubs.
And shrubs.
We just, at Esperanza, we've got, and shrubs are really important. I love seeing shrubs. I was like, yes, because, if you're a birder, you need the shrubs. And folks, not necessarily everyone in the environmental movement understands the importance of shrubs. But
You're a shrub hugger.
That's right. But I would also say it's really important to plant the right trees, for example. So, for instance, Palo Verdes. I mean, sycamores use a lot of water, but there is an environmental benefit to them. Oaks, but once they get started, a lot of times they're able to continue without needing a lot of water.
But so I think that brings up something that I find really fascinating.
Raise your hand if you wanted to.
About the study, which is that, so for the kids to have the benefits, it doesn't matter what kinds of shrubs and what kinds of trees. For other organisms, it matters hugely, and for conservation, it matters hugely. And so I think that'll be the tricky thing. How do we bring these two things together? And I would say the same thing about the health aspects. I mean, asphalt is actually terrible. I mean, whenever I fall on my morning runs, I curse how much asphalt there is. But on the other hand, it's also true that, when you look at the history of development of the city in Europe and in the Americas, there was a reason that we moved a lot of the agriculture and a lot of the animals and a lot of the plants out of the city. And it was the idea of creating a sanitary environment. And you wouldn't want to bring all of that back. And right now, even in LA County, there's real constraints on where and how you can keep chickens and where and how you can keep bees, because people are worried about hygiene, and they're worried about allergies, and they're worried about people being stung. And, with mosquito-borne diseases, we know that people are concerned about some of the things that, as environmentalists, we love, which is having a lot of bugs around. Well, a lot of people are, sometimes with justification and sometimes not really worried about them. So I think that's the tricky thing. How do we balance the health benefits of nature against justified concerns about what bringing in certain kinds of nature might mean for health? And then how do we also counteract ideas that are simply wrong about health implications?
Just quickly, can I just say, as a principal, I was worried about that as in 2009 when we began this work. And just in planting natives, what would we attract? But we had absolutely no problems with anything like bee stings or mosquitoes. It's just been what we planted became a living laboratory for the students.
There was a question here.
So I had a question that goes to the Margot Griswold, the Los Angeles Audubon Society, working with Brad. My question is how we scale this up. And I love the fact that just seeing trees moving to Los Angeles from the Central Valley, where I farmed amongst the Valley Oaks, I had a nervous breakdown. Clearly couldn't take the lack of nature here, which led me to working with Brad and others, Stacy Vigilon and Cindy Harden, in our outdoor education programs. So scaling up, we had our task force with the LA Unified School District, largest landowner in Los Angeles County. And that's how we can move forward. All those schoolyards. We're not the first to think of this. Esther Feldman has ideas, water, runoff, treating water runoff so that you can have different habitats. But it's the linking of stewardship and partnerships, such as with the Nature Conservancy, with Los Angeles Audubon Society, or other local chapters of Audubon, and bringing people back into the idea that somebody isn't going to do this for you, I think, because no one's going to do it for us. They're going to put asphalt in because it's safer. It's cleaner. Your management people around the campus, they don't have to deal with our messy plants. You know, it's a crazy thing. But unless we all get involved in that type of partnership, funding as well as volunteer hours, I don't think it's going to happen. And it's so important what you're showing. I'm so excited about. I think Brad's school, Leopoldini, showed actual test scores rising as well. But it's great when you see real science done on it. We can talk and wave our hands. But so I would say partnerships, stewardship, and that's how we can scale it.
Thanks. Okay. Why don't we do the red shirt and then the green shirt in the back? Please introduce yourselves.
Yes, my name is Jerry Daly. I'm a union rep and organizer. This is for Brad.
Oh, hi.
Yes, hi. Just a question. What response, if any, have you gotten from the parents of your students to the improvements you've made, the native plantings and the duck projects and so on?
They would get really upset with me when we were hiking in Debs Park because we were going up the hill. My favorite photo is about 7 moms chasing me saying, "You made us hike too far." So, but that's a really important part of that. Of course, I'm joking. That's a really important part of this because we worked together to remove the Bermuda grass. And I remember that first Saturday doing that. What I didn't expect was, it was really hard work. I have so much respect for Bermuda grass. And at the end of those, 4 or 5 hours, the parents all came up to me and said, "We want to come back next Saturday." And they really bonded, I think, with the land of their students' school right there, and that never waned. And as a principal, a lot of times we are principals can be agenda setters. Of course, that's with the teachers. It's a total partnership. But you can start to set the agenda by making available to parents opportunities to get out there and go hiking, go bird watching, all of those activities.
Can I ask what about MacArthur Park? Were there any trepidation? That there can be some sketchy parts of that park.
So with 3rd grade, we bird watch in MacArthur Park 3 times during the school year and then compare and contrast what we see. Of course, big questions come up about migration. And there have been absolutely no problems there. So it's great to have the parents along.
And the parents don't mind.
Parents come along.
There's a lot of other things going on in that park other than bird watching.
Yeah. We go in the morning, and I have to say, I've really bonded with that park. So it's an incredible public space.
It's interesting what you've said, about the schools and the schoolyards and this point about stewardship too. I think this is what the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, for example, has discovered about creating green spaces and parks in some of LA's most park-poor neighborhoods, that sometimes the reaction is, no, we don't want to park there. Because if you put a park there, it's going to become a haven for things that we don't want in the neighborhood. Dealers, violence, and those kinds of things. So linking it actually to people having some responsibility and stewardship, and that there's actually there's programming there. If they want a fence around it, there's a fence around. That's really working with the community to figure out what the park means, and in a sense, what nature means other than just nature. It's all these other things that are super important.
So a lot of this goes back to the idea of just getting folks outside, and folks that maybe in their neighborhood traditionally have stayed inside because it's safer. And anecdotally, I'll say from at Leo Politi Elementary School, right there in Pico Union, over time, the exterior perimeter of the school actually became a de facto running and bicycling track. And I recall, 9 o'clock at night, you'd see single women running around the perimeter of the school. That's empowerment, okay? And I think all of this ties together. So what happens on a school campus in the work that we do in connecting folks to nature, it can permeate, or extend, I should say, it can extend way beyond the school boundaries into the actual community.
I see you taking notes. Did you have anything to add to that?
I'm taking notes for my final answer.
Should we have another question in the back, the green shirt, and then there's a couple over here, and there's lots of questions, and we've got some time, so relax and dig in, and we'll have a great conversation.
Thank you. Heather, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very challenging to the thought patterns that most of us, we give thought to, but not very much action once we understand what's going on. I want to thank you for bringing up the econometric connection here, because you're looking at significant economic scale when you challenge our thinking as you have here. And if you think about it, everybody in this room is probably, we're grown-ups, we're not kids, and we're voters, and we're taxpayers, and we're actually the budget financiers, if you think about it. Budget is money with intent, and it comes down to figuring out what the intents are. If the intent is to provide for a better, healthier, more stimulating, or at least a chance of stimulation in your environment, then your research is really important. And if you're trying to put it into the environment of the California educational system, which is really a state-run agency as opposed to a locally run or a city-run agency, you have to find partnerships at the local level. And it might be really worthwhile having the panelists talk about that. But the second part that I want to toss into the heap is that you're in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area as you sit here. There's a magazine called Outdoors, and it's about the 155,000 acres of the National Recreation Area here. It's our national park. And the kids from your school, are invited to come into the national park lands this year because it's the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. The president established a program of EKIP, every kid in the park. And if you bring a kid, of course, you got to bring the whole family. So here's an opportunity to bring folks into the parklands and use the value that we put into those areas. So if you would comment on how we can use the existing park and environmental and ecological systems that are already paid for, and all we need to do now is make the connection, probably a transportation solving problem, but even MTA can help us figure some of that out if we work together. But your thoughts on those things?
Sure. Yeah. Sure, this might seem a little tangential, but I promise it'll get there. So I think one of the big challenges we have in figuring out how to connect, what I'm talking about to getting people to go to the valuable resources we already have has a lot to do with how we talk about those resources, right? The people who want to go for a hike are already going for a hike. The people who want to go bird watching, go bird watching. Most of the time, they find a way, right? But if people aren't thinking about those things, they're not going to go to the park. So what should we be talking to them about that does inspire them to go to the park? If it's health benefits, is the park advertising health benefits for people who come to the park? Are they advertising that you'll be smarter when you go home? I mean, these are very different messages to give from an invitation perspective that would engage very different people. And this is the part that's a little tangential, but I think very relevant. I met earlier last year with the Land Trust Alliance of the United States. And a couple of people there talked about how there was a park, one particular land trust was running, and they really wanted to engage the Latino community where they were more. They didn't have many Latino people visiting, and so they ran a Latino Day, and they ran it in a way that they thought would engage Latinos, and nobody came. And then, oh my gosh, they asked the Latinos. And the Latinos came up with a really different version of that day, and they ran it, and lots of them came. And so I just think there's something really important to think about here in terms of what the message is. Like, what are we telling people about the parks so that they want to engage, so that we're resonating with an issue that's important to them, that has a real basis, right, for them to benefit from it. That list is so much longer than what we talk about now.
I think this is what I meant. So if we start by asking the question,
yes.
What does nature mean to you? Well, we might start to get, and I think you've thought about that. I mean, the cultural meanings of nature, which are very variable.
Yeah. I think it's a
the
little
values
different,
that people have. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's really important, but I also think there's lots of there's lots of things about nature people don't think of, right? That if we ask them, what's nature mean to you, they won't come up with.
Yeah, and I don't mean just to ask it in just that way, but to find ways to ask that question, like you said about, if you just, that what the Latino community came up with was quite different from what the traditional land trusts came up with.
No, I was just going to add, I think that's a really great example, and I think that's something that we're finding in a lot of places, that things like bird watching and hiking are actually pretty culturally specific ways of engaging with nature that to a lot of people are either irrelevant or totally boring, and especially to a lot of younger people who when they go out there, Latino and African American groups actually often want to go out in groups, want to have a picnic. That sort of lonely hiking or hiking with two people and being really quiet so we don't scare away the birds is itself a very culturally specific way of interacting with nature. So opening it up to a variety of different activities and a variety of different things you can do in these natural spaces, and for a lot of younger people, ability to listen to music, to do some kind of athletic activity. We had in a class that we taught on biocities at UCLA, we had an architect coming in who started his presentation with a sign of all the things that are forbidden in an average LA park. And it's all the things that you want to do, like skateboarding, like having a picnic, like lighting a campfire, like playing like loud music, exactly. All the stuff that you actually do want to get out of your apartment do are actually forbidden in a lot of parks. So I think finding ways of combining the social and cultural uses that people have of these spaces with then ways of also alerting them to who the non-humans are, who they're interacting with, and who might also benefit from their presence there if they do it right. I think that's the tricky thing to figure out.
And I want to start taking notes now too. But I would just add to all of this, which is great, that I do think that children can be the ambassadors, because it's so interesting. A lot of the families that I deal with are from Guatemala. They may be from rural communities, but they've given that up because they have hope in downtown Los Angeles. They have a chance. But so the nature may not be, it may be a memory for them, but it's not part of their present. I've seen that children can then become the ambassadors in their families. I think this is true for urban youth at the high school level too. And you don't know where it will end. I know in Los Angeles Audubon Society basically became the de facto college counselors. And I don't know exactly how many of those students ended up from Dorsey High School in UC Santa Cruz. But I think it's more than two hands worth, and so on. You don't know where this will end.
I'm Phil Rundle. I'm from UCLA. I'm involved with the botanical garden there, and not a small part of our visitors are people connected with medical center, patients, family, staff. Mm-hmm. And so we're really interested in this concept of nature and how does the garden match with real nature. But one of the things we haven't talked about is that there's lots of ways of perceiving nature, and we've been talking only about visual. And the one thing that a garden does a little bit, and real nature does much more, is there's more senses than just our eyes. So nature has a smell, it has sounds, and it even has a taste sometimes. I think these are all components that we really need to think about in terms of the stimulation of nature and how biodiversity ties into it.
Well, and speaking of taste, I mean, that brings up gardens, of course. Yes.
Last year I published a book.
Go ahead and introduce yourself, too.
Oh, sorry. Randy Olson. Last year I published a book on narrative, and about 2 weeks before the final deadline for my manuscript, I went to a panel discussion at the LA Book Festival, and one of the panelists talked about something called the declensionist narrative. I had never heard of that. I ran home and fortunately managed to research it and squeeze it into the book just before the deadline. The guy who managed it was John Christensen. Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Yes, which is very interesting, because what that is the idea, this age-old tendency for some people to just simply innately believe that the world is in decline, it's falling to pieces, and regardless of whatever data you can show them, that's what they're going to cling on to. So, what about the narrative of nature is good for you? Have people done research on that? Do these kids have that programmed into them from their parents? I mean, I think I had that programmed into me, but it must be a factor in your studies of how much is this as actual physiological response from them versus their brain already saying nature is good for you. Are there studies on, or is there such a thing as the nature is good for you narrative?
Well, that's a narrative that's 200 years old that comes from European Romanticism. I mean, before that, neither anybody in Europe nor anybody in the United States believed that nature was good for you. I mean, the Puritans talked about nature as the howling wilderness, somewhere between savage and satanic, inhabited by demonic heathens worshiping other gods. I mean, that was the traditional notion of wilderness until circa 1800, and in Europe it wasn't that different. So the idea that nature is good for you and therapeutic and that it's awesome to be out there is historically very specific, and it's a reaction. I mean, that's itself a narrative that arose at a very particular moment of history in Europe and North America that was a reaction to the industrialization, and where for the first time actually people started to think that rather than nature threatening us with disasters, diseases, wild animals, crop failures, all the horrible things that nature can do to you, as well as all the benefits, that we were starting to threaten nature. I mean, it's a very specific moment. And it's interesting that is still not everywhere the narrative. I mean, John and I were in Australia, in Melbourne, a couple of years ago, and had brunch in Melbourne on in a pastoral setting, on a river in Melbourne with a bunch of people from the University of Melbourne as well as environmental organizations, and they told us, I mean, what you Americans always talk about, take the kids out into nature or have them play on the river. Well, even on this river in Melbourne, you can tell your kids that, but you have to always tell them also to really watch out for the snakes, because nature is still really, really dangerous. So I mean, I think that narrative, yes, I mean, literary cultural scholars have a lot to say about the narrative of nature is good for you, and where it comes from, and who believed that, and who didn't, and I mean, what kind of nature is good for you also. That's culturally very, very clearly conditioned. I mean, where, the association of the countryside with good nature, for example, wasn't prevalent among African Americans in the 19th century. For whom it was associated with plantations and slavery and so on. So there is a lot of study of that.
I just add a little there that's come up in a really interesting way for me in my own work, which is that the Nature Conservancy just went through organizationally a discussion about what our vision was. And we came out with a vision statement that for the first time sort of says we want nature to thrive both for its own sake and its ability to add to human life. And that conversation inside the organization included people from around the world, from our field offices. And we had a core team that included an amazing woman, Engtuya Oidiv, from Mongolia. And every time we met, she would just sit there and look at us, like perplexed for at least an hour as we're like wrangling between people and nature, and she's like, I just don't understand you people. she's like, they're just together. And she was really presenting very clearly, a completely different worldview that's very active and held very tightly in many Eastern cultures. It's completely different than the way we approach it here. So I think it's really neat to have these trajectories thought of and reflected in, how we think about the bigger picture of the narrative globally.
Well, no, just to add a detail, you're bringing up the families from Guatemala and other places. We know that in the last 15, 20 years in California, that every major environmental bond and measure that has passed because it's been disproportionately supported by Latino voters. So there are things going on there that we don't fully understand, but are very, very culturally relevant and powerful, and may very well have to do with narratives.
I'm a teacher. I've been teaching 28 years, first, second, third, and I don't know you. But
introduce yourself, please.
My name is Tori Watson. I teach in Saugus SUSD, just down the road. And I teach 81% unduplicated, which is what you guys have been talking about. That means kids foster care, kids that are raised by their grandparents or other relatives, and kids that are on free and reduced lunch. And in my school, it's a super old school, if you can imagine. 20 out of 28 of my kids, their parents don't speak English. It's all Spanish. And my school, of course, because it's an older school in the least affluent part of town, has tons and tons and tons of green space. Because back in the day, in the 50s, we used to build schools around the park concept. We have huge trees everywhere on my campus, tons of grass. And I know this may not be a direct correlation, but my school has the same test scores, CASP last year, as other schools that only had 14% non-duplicated and affluent schools. And I look around my school, and the big difference is the commitment of the teachers. You don't get people in schools like that with really good test scores unless you have an unbelievable staff and an unbelievable group of people. So my question is, how do we get the teachers involved? How do we give that? How do I get my hands on this presentation so I can introduce it at my school site? And then I'm popular in my district, how I can give it, because the superintendent knows me by first name. Oh, hi, Tori. So how do I get it to my superintendent? Because they have just recently built 2 schools, the fancy schools, with rooms that look like this for their state, unbelievable, state-of-the-art everything. Not a tree on campus, of course. And it's interesting that my test scores are similar, even though they have the exact opposite population, but I have tons of trees and stuff everywhere. So I feel like if you could get a hold of teachers, if there's a way for you to get a hold of teachers, we are like a train. You cannot stop us. And you'll attest to that. Absolutely. We have a huge voice. Parents love us. PTAs love us. We haven't had a multi-use in my school in 50 years, no multi-use room. And this year, I started the parents at my school, the PTA, and remember, it's all Hispanic, it's all people who don't speak English, have to work 2 jobs, often only one parent in the house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They came out full force, and now they had to change the whole plan for our bond money, and now they're now giving us a multi-use room. So, and that's from teachers. So if you can get the teachers in, and trust me, we've been teaching nature since the 28 years I've been there. We teach nature all the time. But this concept to the parents of conservation and the next gen standards that we're going to be doing in science next year, all of that is very much left out, because in the powers that be in education, they believe the concept of teaching kids nature is teaching them life cycle and how things work and how a plant grows, and just the very extreme basics that you could teach if your focus was instead on conservation, etc. And they always have teachers. We help write the curriculum, in fact, in the big picture. If we volunteer, we can go to the state and we have input on Common Core standards, on all of that. So if you could only explain to me, how am I going to get my colleagues, I only have 2 years left, so you got to do it fast.
Hey, Tori.
How do we get involved?
So I'm just wondering if your school was on that map of the 100 schools that Heather showed, and maybe you skewed the results.
I think that's fantastic, and I mean, I'd love to hear what works with engaging with teachers. I know there's several people in the room who are already in these kinds of partnerships and probably have more to say than I can add on that. But that's exactly the kind of thing I need to hear, right, in terms of where the pathways are for the information to go. Because now we can tailor it in a way that works for you for those communication pathways, and that's exactly what we need to hear.
And Tori and I know that your research will help the teachers, because the teachers who want to do this work, or the principals that want to do this work, because when you have research behind it, it's all about research-based strategies and implementing those, and here's the research. So, but teachers also need permission, don't you? You need permission from your supervisors, from the school board, you know, within the hierarchy. There needs to be permission to go outside.
Well, I think we're nearing the time, so I'd like to ask that. Like to ask that final question of, you know, I think, Heather, you're sort of starting with Tori's question, also kind of getting to a theory of change or a logic model, and who are the audiences that we need to influence in order to get these kinds of changes, and you were talking about that as well. I have a very simple idea, which is that we establish a minimum daily requirement of trees and shrubs. But what are your thoughts about how we make that? Where do we go from here, and how do we make the connection from this work to the larger world of, well, the world of conservation? Who wants to start? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm actually going to start with something that Tori brought up that we haven't really, two things that we haven't talked about. One is questions of idea of design. And I totally hear you, Tori. I went to a university in Cologne where we were in a building where the architects won a prize, and all of the auditoria were worse than this. I mean, there were bare concrete walls and bright green carpets. And none of the students,
well, at least it was green.
We were college students. You know. Yeah, it was green. I suppose that counts for something, but it was plasticky green, right? I mean, so I think the question of design and architecture we haven't brought up. And I think that's a really, really crucial question for built environments. And the whole idea that the city is sort of what we design, and where both the planning and then the design and architecture are geared toward the aesthetic taste and the physical and psychological needs of humans is something that's really an area where a lot of change is needed. And it's only changed in the smallest possible way so far through the introduction of things like green roofs. But thinking about our built structures, and why is it that apartment buildings are so devoid of nature now? They don't have to be. There could be rooftop gardens, there could be green walls, and the whole structure could be conceived in such a way that whether people are aware of nature and whether they want nature around or not, that nature, that other species can actually use it, that birds can nest, that insects can find nooks and crannies. And that's something that we've lost a little bit with modern architecture of both the ugly and the aesthetically pleasing kinds, that a lot of our modern buildings do not have the sort of nooks and crannies that that in an old farmhouse or in a ruined building, other species find places to live. And so finding ways of reintroducing that into design, and there are companies that do that. I mean, there are companies in England and Germany that fabricate bricks that have built in, that are standard size bricks as they are commonly used in building, that have built in openings and cavities for birds to nest. And in Germany, you know, it's very specific. So here's your bricks for martins, here's your bricks for swallows, here's your bricks for sparrows. So you can get different kinds. So it's perfectly possible to do that. And so to think about the way in which we design these structures, not only that we're not in these windowless rooms like this one, but also how could these kinds of rooms and these kinds of buildings actually become habitat for other species, both plants and different kinds of animals, starting with the bugs and the birds, and from there on up. The other thing is, we haven't really talked about the economics of this very much, and that's another thing that I think in Southern California in particular is important. And I know you've written about the possible impending end of the indoor-outdoor lifestyle, because I think all of us, when we look around buildings, both residential and institutional buildings, they tend to get bigger and bigger, because that's where the economic incentive is to offer interior space, and the exterior space gets smaller and smaller. And thereby one way of scaling up these kinds of efforts, which is by people planting native plants, or at least, you know, ecologically functional plants in their backyards, well, the space to do that gets smaller and smaller. And that's something that, you know, certain parts of LA County, you know, the neighborhood councils and so forth have risen up, and they've now passed regulations, and there's a certain, you know, area to building ratio that gets enforced. But in a lot of places, that's not the case, and new buildings just simply have no green space around them. So that, you know, thinking about the economic incentives for that, and what could be done about them by way of building regulations and building codes and urban planning that can actually work to enhance it, I think is a really important part of getting some of this done.
Brad, you want to go?
It's great. Well, one of the things which drew me to my new campus is just that it's simply asphalt, concrete. There really is very little nature on the campus.
So huge opportunity.
Opportunity, right. And in October, we're going to be doing the rewilding of Wilshire Boulevard. And it's funded, and we're going to also be, we've taken out in another part of campus, we took out 1,000 square feet there and had a little strip, right, storefront, Wilshire Boulevard. And on another part, working with Los Angeles Audubon Society on about 5,000 square feet. They took out a bungalow. I said, you can have the bungalow, but take the asphalt too, and they said, okay. And so we'll do that. And by the way, that's being funded through Los Angeles Audubon Society received the funding from the UCLA philanthropy class, which I think is worth noting. But I'm going to limit my comments very briefly just to schools. And for instance, Los Angeles Unified School District, huge amount of land. Imagine if that did become an urban flyway, and not just for birds, but also strong flyers like insects. And I think what we need is a reimagining. I think to do that, we need to have partners with us. I've seen the power of the partnership through, I hate to say it again, but Los Angeles Audubon Society, a small or not so small, it's a big area, but a local organization doing amazing work, which really has become a model much beyond Los Angeles County. But involving folks like people in this room that know, that can look at asphalt, look at a campus, imagine what could be there. But I would say in doing that, involve students, because I've learned that high school students can become tremendous experts while they're still in school, and then involve the students who will receive benefit from whatever changes happen. And why not have a strike team go from school to school and make this happen across the land? There's so much to be gained in doing so. Every school has its own natural history worth exploring.
And never underestimate the power of birds.
Birds are massive.
I mean, the LA is I think the most birdios
I would say
area
so.
of California, right? And the most bird-watching O's.
I would add to that, though, never underestimate the power of birds to draw students in and turn them into citizen scientists.
Heather?
I want to build on the planning concept because we talked today just about health and education. There's lots of other benefits that are being explored scientifically from better city planning and urban green space, like stormwater runoff and many other pieces that end up being a whole stack of benefits from one change in city planning. And I think there's some opportunities to learn from what other cities are doing and do it better here. So for example, DC's passed a building code change now where any building over a certain footprint has to deal with all of its own stormwater runoff on site. And they can do that through wetlands, through on-site restored areas, or they can pay into other areas. Maybe that could be targeted at schools, right, that are green spaces that are contributed to because of a building code change where you're making connections in the city through a suite of benefits that have major public value. And now you have, multiple good things happening for the city. You have a funding stream that can drive some of these changes across the land, which I think is a brilliant way to think of it here, but that touches on a whole suite of things we now know nature can add to a thriving city.
Okay, I think our time has come. That was an amazing hour of Q&A, and I thank you all for that. Just a couple of things. Thank you again to our amazing panelists and to our fabulous moderator, John. Thank you also to the people in the audience who are doing a lot. Thank you, Tori. Thank you, Margot. Thank you to the folks who are making this a major contribution in their lives, day in and day out. We heard a lot about engaging with students. Again, if you're interested in either yourselves engaging with some of our students or having your kids or your students engaging with our students, please go outside, stick your name on the sign-up sheet, and get together with a few of our UCLA students who are themselves trying to engage and reach out to the broad community. And one more time, thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. Have a great night.